Hi, Tobyn. It's really nice and special to talk to you today because we never actually really met, but from sending emails and talking to you shortly, I am really looking forward to this conversation because I think it will be very inspiring for people to listen to. So thanks for being here.
It's nice to meet you too.
Let me introduce you to people that are listening. Dr. Tobyn Bell is a compassion-focused therapist and part of the training executive for the Compassionate Mind Foundation. He has co-authored the book Compassion-Focused Therapy from the Inside Out, which I urgently need to order and read myself. It's a self-practice, self-reflection workbook for therapists. I think as therapists, we cannot be compassionate enough for ourselves in the first place. And you're also a cognitive behavioral therapy trainer, supervisor, and program lead at the Greater Manchester CBT Training Center, which is associated with Manchester University. You have published research on compassion as well. Did I leave anything out?
No, I mean, I've changed job a little bit. So I work at the Manchester University at the moment on their clinical psychology doctorate. And I'm not quite a doctor myself yet. My PhD finishes this year, which has been part-time. So it's taken years and years. So one day, hopefully, by the end of the year, that will be so.
Okay. That's nice to hear. Sometimes it just takes a while to complete it amongst other activities, right?
Yeah, alongside clinical work and parenting and teaching and yeah.
Yeah, exactly. For you, is it like someone asked me this question once? Is it a coincidence that you do what you do today?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it kind of ever is really. I think it's interesting. I mean, I became a nurse first. I'm a nurse by background before doing psychotherapy training. And I think that decision was led to by life experiences that I had when I was younger, particularly being in hospital myself and being cared for mental health problems when I was younger. But then I think, choosing psychotherapy, and then it's interesting about the client group that you start working with, particularly people who lack compassion, who are self-critical and are self-hating. I don't think it's a huge surprise that I'm finding myself with that group, particularly with depression and whatnot. I think interestingly, because of my experience, I've chosen not to work with some groups of people as well, or just don't feel like I have an affinity with that, or don't want to engage in that anymore. But definitely, it's very linked, I think. And the interest in compassion, which has benefited me, benefited others, I hope. It seems very personal as well as professional.
Mm-hmm. For me, it was definitely choosing to work with ACT. For me, the acceptance part, the values part, finding your heart in the things that you do in your life really saved me in a way. I got to know these methods when I was nearly 30 and 20. And for me, suffering myself from depression and anxiety attacks and all of that for a long time, from my teens till nearly being 30 years old. This was the thing that saved me. Yeah.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because I think the things that bring us into the work make us really good on, or from my experience myself and with others, make us really good in some areas, but also make us quite vulnerable in other areas too. And like everybody, we have our blind spots too, don't we? Yeah. I mean, I think particularly like compassion and ACT are lovely because they kind of acknowledge that you can't get rid of certain things, certain difficulties and problems and patterns are part of being human. The cognitive loops or fusions that kind of occur, they're always going to offer themselves. And in CFT, the big, huge emotions and motives, they're part of who we are, but we can learn to manage them, but we can't learn to get rid of them. I think it was the first time that I ever heard therapies talking in that way. Because I was trained in CBT originally, and I think there is like an underpinning or implicit message that you can eradicate maybe symptoms, and that's the aim. And that worked for me a little bit personally, and I think it works for other people brilliantly at times if that's what they want. But I think for other folk and myself, it's the patterns and problems that don't go away, that do linger, that you have to kind of get to know and befriend and accept, that are the important ones to work on.
I think that acceptance and vulnerability are part of my life, like in a fluent way that I can deal with it and that I can, go to it when I need it. And at the same time, when I'm vulnerable, it just catches me, and I don't even think of it anymore. It's gone. I'm just going for a battle with
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah. I think those times where it does hit, I mean, it is a gift in a way or a prompt to practice self-compassion. And I think it always remains humbling in the work that we do in psychotherapy, because it's a never-ending practice.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that you complete yourself
Mm-hmm.
as a therapist or as a client, I don't think.
Yeah, true. So you were in the hospital when you were younger?
Yeah, when I was younger, in my teenage years, with depression, anorexia, for quite well, in and out for years, from maybe 17, age of 17, for a few years.
Wow.
This seemed like just lost years, really. Yeah.
That's quote unquote beautifully said. Yes, those are lost years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. It's funny looking back, because it, obviously is me and is part of me, but it feels relatively distant as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it particularly striking different sections of your life when you become a parent. I suppose it seems to be my son's quite young, so that sort of demarked a real shift again into a different role, and that feels quite a long way away from where I was.
And so, I mean, for me, looking back, it feels like it's a long time ago, and it's not it's part of who I am, and it's not part of who I am anymore. So that's what you said, the vulnerability part. Where do you still notice it? If I can ask.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the eating side of things is fine. I'm not too bothered by that, to be honest. But the low mood, it's almost like, I don't know. I think kind of depression's kind of an interesting one, because it's obviously the end point of quite a lot of different processes, but also it feels like a coping mechanism too, in a way that just shuts you down and says you don't care, or cuts you off from certain things. So I think this kind of lid or shut off or collapse, or giving up, or like helplessness, I think that sometimes comes up. I think that offers itself quite readily to things. And I think it's almost like a go-to in my head. Sort of would say, "Oh, don't worry, just give up. It's not going to be worth it. It won't be any good." And I think over the years, to seeing it more and more as a kind of defensive, protective strategy, and learning to listen to the vulnerability underneath it. I mean, it's not very nice in itself, but I think the more vulnerable feelings underneath it, for example, in answering that, it might be, well, actually, you kind of do want to go out and see people. And I know that the sort of depression offers and said, "Oh, don't bother, you won't like it," but maybe I will, and maybe I won't. And I do feel vulnerable socially, and that's the kind of area I need to kind of keep working on. I think the vulnerabilities underneath that depression offers to help me with, and offers a route out of. Says don't bother.
Yeah. I had a conversation yesterday with Rob, and we were talking about being honest and how difficult it is to, which is a kind of a weird thing to say, but as a human being, how difficult it is to be honest with ourselves. And maybe it is especially difficult when we're feeling so in pain, that it's and we're how do you say that, we're forced to go to survival mode.
Yeah.
A veil comes over us, and then we still have to have a conversation with ourselves.
Yeah. I think survival, like you said, like the survival mode is so subtle sometimes too, that particularly the the kind of drive-based ways of coping that get so reinforced socially, that are really part of unhelpful patterns. I think they're the ones that are quite hard to break and shake as well. Particularly, I think, if you don't feel so great about yourself at times, and you are doing something and you are getting reinforcement, it's really hard to let go of that and say, I don't want to work 24/7. I don't want to have to pick up that job or that piece of research or what have you, or that training. But I think that's kind of the next step, I think, for me, is like saying no more often to things that are fantastic opportunities, but maybe don't serve me.
Yeah, hearing that voice and making the choice is so hard to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I think is so helpful in compassion-focused therapy for myself and for others, is that it's that voice you're trying to cultivate, the compassionate voice. And compassion is not, I mean, it can be soothing and it can be down-regulating and settling and calming, but it also needs to be really firm at times. So, for example, being tempted to pick up another piece of work, it would be quite firm and saying, don't do it out of care for you. You can't do it. I don't want you to do it. So I think that's a really helpful thing for clients to learn, and for everybody to learn, is that compassion is can be really tough and can be really strong and can be really committed, and all those things, in the way that a good parent is to a child.
Yeah, like if I am invested in me, then I need to be responsible and say, no, I won't do such and such.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you're saying, because I'm a firm believer of that myself, that it sometimes is so subtle that we go into survival mode, especially when we're positively reinforced by our environment on what we're doing. But I often say I'm better at managing crises and heavy emotions than I am at daily stress and daily anxiety, because that's subtle, too subtle to notice sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's probably very true. You sometimes need it writ large, don't you, to really capture it and catch it. Yeah, which is a kind of sad thing. It's almost kind of waiting for a crisis or waiting for some kind of tricky impact before making choices. I can't remember, I was talking to someone else the other day about that. Like it's kind of too easy with the subtle stuff just to keep going, and you almost, which is sad, you're kind of waiting for like a health scare or something before you stop working so hard, which just seems crazy, really.
Yeah, but survival strategies are strong, powerful things.
For good reasons, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So what have you learned about, I mean, that's a big question that just, time is too short to answer, way too short to answer, but how does compassion look like in your own life? Maybe is that the question that I want to ask.
Yeah, what does compassion look like? I think it's around the difficult choices. I think maybe it's about trying to be more honest with things. I think one of my survival strategies is relatively people pleasing and being perhaps too focused on others' minds and needs and what have you. And I think I can really easily lose track of my experiences and my needs and even just my reality, really, what's true for me. And I think compassion more and more lately, I think, and how it's showing up. So answering that about recently, how it's showing up, is more and more thinking, what is actually true for me, and trying to answer that, and trying to be confident enough to manage disagreements, disappointments. Like you said at the beginning, being more honest, I think. Because I think compassion is about, I mean, for the definitions that we often use, is that like sensitivity to suffering, and then being committed to its alleviation. And I think the sensitivity to suffering bit's really key to that. Is like, what actually is wrong, what actually is causing you distress, and what actually is present for you, what needs caring attention. I think if you're really good at sort of jumping into other people's minds and needs, that first stage of tuning into your own, I think is really important. And then I suppose it's the courage of taking that outwards and making something in the world.
Yeah, and that's both are tough, right?
To admit, to listen to, and then to kind of do something about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When I talked to Russell Coles, we talked about anger and compassion, and it's a bit in the same line. If you're like angry, it's so much easier to tackle, to handle it, to go into the anger instead of looking at what's underneath, what's really going on for me. Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah, I think that's the same. Like saying earlier with the kind of depressed responding, that you have to listen to what's underneath, what is causing the depression, or what is the depression depressing, to actually get to the heart of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Otherwise, you kind of enact it, and then the problem's then dealing with your anger and your people's response to your anger, or your depression symptoms and people's response to your depression symptoms, and it's quite a long journey to actually get to what's underneath, I think.
Mm-hmm. So that's the thing that you do is to like have this most honest conversation with yourself, or trying to, and then
try to, I think. Yeah. I think for a long time it was, the compassion part was just really an answer to the criticism and kind of self-shame, really. But now I think it's becoming slightly different about maybe being more honest, I think, and the courage to maybe own like my story a little bit. So like talk to people about kind of what actually did go on, rather than pretend it didn't. Mm-hmm. Maybe taking up more space and putting myself forward for things, which is really difficult. Like having a spotlight just doesn't go with my upbringing and how I've coped, really, by making myself smaller.
Yeah, I saw your face when I said it. We're going to send this out via YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's difficult, because it does, then there are whole new things that I never used to even have to deal with. So you're never having, like, if you're really critical and you do kind of collapse, you do get low, you don't have to deal with things like pride and like competition with other people, because you kind of duck out of those. But now you have to engage in those things and manage those new feelings that you have, or new feelings that you elicit from other people, if they want to undermine what you're doing, for example, or challenge it, which you'd never get if you didn't put yourself out there. So I think that feels like the kind of edge I'm working on at the moment. Yeah.
It does remind me of how many layers a depression can have. Like, you're still working through bits and pieces of it, it seems.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. Yeah.
And it is so, I mean, it's so courageous, and it's not easy to then say, like, I think it's very wise. That's what I want to say. What you're saying, like, if you're dealing with depression, then you don't have to deal with a lot of things that are going on in your life.
Yeah. I mean, it's one pain. I can't remember if it's from sort of coherence therapy, but the question is almost like, why is this pain preferable to that pain? So like the pain of depression in some way is known, and it's easier and it's safer, and then the pain of actually putting yourself forward and having to engage in conflict and tolerating your anger and others' anger. Actually, the depressed pain in my past has been more preferable, but now it isn't. And I think actually dealing with anger is the thing. So like the flip side of Russell's, actually that's the stuff that I need to work on and practice and embody skillfully, etc. So using anger in a really healthy way, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which kind of fits lots of the older sort of psychodynamic views of depression, really, in terms of inward anger, etc. I think there is a real truth to some of that, but then how do you externalize it, and how do you then use your own anger, particularly the critic? I mean, the critic, is so full of like absolute kind of like depressed people that often work with are absolutely furiously angry, but it's often with themselves. But they like the palpable sense of like anger, fury, and hatred is so clear. I suppose, it's almost like changing its direction, facilitating it, thinking about like healthy protests when needs weren't met, and finding ways to be assertive, etc., in current life.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting how you describe it. Yeah. And it's also, it also is, I mean, so harmful to, at the moment, when you fall into depression, it doesn't feel like a conscious choice or something, but it is at a certain point something you can turn around.
And I think noticing that point where you'd lean into it a little bit when you do have choice points, when you are aware of your patterns, and I think, when you do feel yourself leaning into it a little bit, I'm not saying there is maybe there is a degree of, I think the nice thing about CFT, it kind of captures the dichotomy of that, like it's not your fault, but it kind of is your responsibility, which I think, so that always offered me a way through that in a way, like, it's not your fault that this happens, or that you want to even lean into it at times, but it is your responsibility, and there are other ways of dealing with it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like de-shaming about the whole process, which is just other layers that keep you caught.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there like any, I mean, I would say tips or exercises that you think of that can help people start up the conversation with themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, some of the things that I find helpful in compassion-focused therapy is sometimes the care for yourself is the hardest flow of compassion. So, for example, we think about compassion as having multiple flows. So, from self to others, from others to self, and then from self to self. And for lots of folk, the self-compassion is the hardest bit. So, in a way, you try and recruit the other flows. So, one of the things that I practice quite a lot is chair work. So, for example, you would put, say, like somebody else on another chair, and you'd practice giving compassion to them, and like somebody who had depression, for example, who had an experience of eating disorder when they're younger, etc. So you can put somebody in the chair who's very similar, or an archetypal figure, or somebody they care about, and practice how you'd talk and how you'd help and support. And you could explore what would it be like to be really critical to them, etc. And no, I'd never do that. And then I suppose what you can do then is then put versions of you into that chair. And then once you've kind of primed the pump and you've got a sense of how you would talk to others, it then becomes, well, let's work through the blocks and the reasons why you can't apply that to yourself, the reasons why you feel you don't deserve it, or what have you. And they become then the subject of therapeutic attention or caring attention. So I think that sense of like working where it gives, which usually is the flow outwards to other people. And once you kind of, sometimes when you imagine yourself on the chair after imagining someone else in that way, that it's so much easier to mentalize and understand yourself from a sort of decentered, externalized kind of position. So I think that's helpful. And I think a similar process is where you might imagine a compassionate other. You might imagine somebody who's perfect for you based on what you need and what you're going through, and picture what they're like. And you could put them on a chair, or you could picture them in your imagination, you flesh them out. And for lots of people, hearing care via another's mind is easier than giving care to oneself. So I could imagine my partner caring for me, or I can imagine my colleague, or I can imagine Russell caring for me. And I know I can think about what he might say, or I can imagine my compassionate other and what they might say. But if I just think, right, what would I say self-compassionately? Sometimes there's that block. So it's almost kind of going out to come in both directions, you caring outwards or others caring for you via imaginary or remembered route. And I suppose that highlights just how compassion is relational. It starts outside of us, it gets internalized. So the relationships with others, even in our imagination, are key, I think.
It reminds me of I've interviewed Dr. Mavis Tsai on FAP and on the ACL global project that she's doing.
Wow.
I'm a volunteer in that project, and coincidentally, yesterday I did a group of ACL meetup, and the mindfulness exercise was one where we beautifully helped people to imagine someone in their someone they care about, and to think about what would be behind those eyes. What do you hear in the voice that's not being said? How can you,
That's nice.
yeah, like what's in their hearts? And if if you would imagine yourself being fully there, present for them, what would that look like? How would that be for you? Imagine yourself being fully present, and then going to, okay, so imagine yourself being fully present to yourself. What's
Same
behind
kind of
you?
process, isn't it?
Yeah. It sounds really familiar to.
Yeah.
It was really lovely, and you could see how people connected to themselves very easily when we did that exercise. So yeah.
Sounds good. Sounds lovely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's kind of interesting with compassion focused therapy, lots of the evidence is building for group work. So there is something about, and it's interesting reading an article about mindfulness that, they're saying it's not maybe what you do, it's who you practice with, in terms of the doing it as a group rather than doing it individually.
Wow.
And it's about, I mean, for me, that was the thing with mindfulness that helped so much, was almost just trusting myself to close my eyes in a group of people and focusing on my body, which felt really scary, both of those things.
Yeah.
So I think there's something about that. The group gets carried into quite internal focused exercises. It's such a different quality doing mindfulness on your own as to doing it with other people.
Yeah, that's actually quite fascinating, because I had the same experience. I think we both have a lot of experience, more than like people who haven't been in our line of work, by doing mindfulness exercises, sitting down, going into silence, all of that. And every time I did a mindfulness exercise, I find it difficult to close my eyes and to just sit down by myself. And I literally, and I never really noticed it, but I literally could feel my heartbeat going up every time that I just sat by myself doing a mindfulness exercise. And I learned, I'm also very interested in polyvagal theory and, nervous system. And I learned that my body at that moment feels like it must do something right. And because it needs to sit um, in a right way, and your eyes need to be closed and you need to do it good, that my body feels a bit closed in, like it's pressured into something, and my heartbeat just goes up. And I know that I'm free to get up whenever I want to, and I know that I can sit comfortable in different ways, and I know all of that, but my body obviously didn't know that. So doing mindfulness now, for me, the same thing works better when I do it with other people, and when I can sit as comfortably as I want to sit. Yeah.
Sounds good. It's a scary feeling, that connection with your body in that way, isn't it? And it's quite isolating. And I guess on top of that, we get lots of critical, self-shaming comments about, like, what does it mean? How would I share it with somebody, etc. It's just it's so private, isn't it? It feels like.
Yeah.
But when it doesn't become private, when it's shared within a group and it's processed in a group, it becomes very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. I like the way that you're are very open in this conversation about how how you experience life and its challenges and difficulties. Is that something that you have always done, or is it something that you've learned to do?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. I guess some things always have felt quite private and not not for like being English, not for polite conversation, really.
Yeah, Belgians are the same.
The same. Yeah, but I think yeah, probably it's. I mean, I guess from compassion work, but I don't know. Maybe it feels like culturally a little bit different. Like the vulnerability side of things, I felt like it was like disconnecting me from my life, really, and my values by not sort of owning. I mean, it's not to make it in a kind of performative sense, talking about what I've been through or what have you, but I think it's more integrated and more acknowledging of what I've been through. So I'd never have talked to anybody about my past, really, in a professional sense with anybody until maybe a couple of years ago. But I think it's quite helpful for other people to have that as a model.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's quite helpful for me. I think it's a good value to be okay with being vulnerable. And I think from doing lots and lots of more training over the last sort of 5-6 years in different countries, I think there's something about, I don't have very long to create a sense of safeness when we practice exercises or we learn about compassion. And I think one way to do it is to try and model that with yourself, really, and who you are, and be willing to open and share things and be considerate about how you are modeling, about how you hold your experience to talk about them. And I think that does, the feedback, that does help, I think, people quite quickly engage in the training and take it further and connect it to themselves and as much as they do their clients. So it's not just a kind of heady cerebral exercise that they're engaging in. It's like a personal thing. So I think, yeah, over the years, it's just become a bit easier. Yeah.
I think what I particularly like is that like I have this story of my life where I left home at 16 and went through this and this and this and this, and I can name the facts, and people often name the facts, but then there
Yeah.
is the scene behind the facts, and how was that for you? And I think that's what, when people feel they're open, they talk about their facts in life, but not really about what that meant for them, and how even when people say I have like an anxiety issue, I don't like to say disorder, but like if that is a challenge, then what does that feel like? How is it to be scared every week, multiple times, being truly anxious, scared of other people, scared of challenges that come your way? That's difficult.
Yeah, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It's kind of colouring in behind the headlines, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I guess in the way that you would do with when you're working with trauma or trauma stories, that often they become quite stereotyped in the way that people tell them, and they get stuck. But it's when you add the colour and when you add the detail and the richness that they start changing almost, and that's like a healthy sign of how memory works. It changes and fluctuates rather than it gets stuck. So I absolutely think so, yeah. I was thinking about there's that I can't remember what the paper's called off the top of my head, but I think it's something like, love yourself as a person, doubt yourself as a therapist. And they're saying that that's the kind of model for like supervision and therapy, is that fundamentally at the core of you, you're okay, and clients and trainees and supervisors pick up on how you relate to yourself, etc. So that's not in question. Like, you've got to hold that sense of care, and that's really helpful modeling. But it's really good to be able to doubt yourself professionally, and actually they kind of go hand in hand, and that's kind of what we kind of know from compassion, is that the more compassion you do have for yourself, the more able you are to talk about things that go wrong. You are able to show up to things when you've caused pain. You know, your guilt's more productive. Like, you're able to shift from shame into guilt and actually seek to repair things and to acknowledge the harm you've done. So I think that seems really important stance, that sort of like central kind of care and love, and then that, well, I can then be open to being human and make mistakes and those kind of things.
That I've just written it down. I think it's such a powerful sentence. Love yourself as a person, doubt yourself as a professional. And I, in my profession, I see a lot of entrepreneurs, and I see them often. I think one of the things that always comes back is impulsivity. How they, like, I want to do this now, and then I want to do that, and I have plans, and I'm thinking. It's almost like when they say I'm thinking about doing da da da, then they're already doing it. And when I say, oh, maybe we can just think about it before you do that, it's just they're too quickly in the way that they act upon things. And I think that if they were to use this as a mantra, like, let me just love myself and let me doubt myself professionally. Are you allowed to doubt yourself professionally? If you love yourself, then you're human. Then you're allowed to make mistakes. Then you're allowed to go slow. Then you're allowed to think about things, to hesitate.
Yeah. And I think it's a nice way of challenging some of the misconceptions around compassion, that, it's all just about, nicey, and, don't worry and everything's forgiven. You don't have to worry about anything. It's kind of the opposite, actually, is that rather than like people worry, oh, it takes me off the hook. It's kind of like, well, actually, it allows you to really face things that are difficult. It allows you to show up to yourself and for other people, and it allows you to acknowledge kind of where you're not doing so well and how to improve. And I think that's a kind of easier sell. I think when you tell folk, and I've never worked in translating compassion to sort of business sense, but that seems like that's something that, I don't know, lots of people would want to be able to do. Like, how do I acknowledge the areas without getting dysregulated, without causing further harm to myself or others? And how do I, be my best support?
Yes,
in doing
exactly.
this stuff.
Yeah. How do I be my best support? Yeah. Yeah, that's a very powerful one.
I think that's another thing about CFT, is that you try and train these voices up. And I can remember for myself that time where, after sort of training this compassionate voice up, that it did to sort of show up automatically. I can remember even where it was in a particular house, walking down a corridor, and usually the criticism would come up, but just something else came up, and it just said, it's okay, and this happened because of this, and we can do something about it. It's like, where's that come from? And it felt so odd after years and years of the opposite. So I think I kind of feel like if I can do it, then other people can in that way. Because when I had really bad depression, that the critic was so bad, it's like a kind of psychotic depression, I suppose, that it became so powerful and disembodied, and I just felt like I couldn't move one way or the other because it would attack me. Mm-hmm. And now I don't have that voice in my head, which I didn't think that was possible.
I have a feeling that people who live in like a high speed way, that they often don't even know they have that voice. They're just running so hard that they don't even know the voice.
Yeah. And it's often when things, like you said, if you were to say slow down, or if you were to think about what would a compassionate other or compassionate self really help with, or really say to them, or really connect to, then that's when they do slow down, and then that's when the voice shows up. Oh no, don't do that. That's that's kind of terrible. So I think, that's the other thing. I think like the biggest tip you can take from like compassion training for me is that, and personally and professionally, is that when you do try and engage in some of these exercises or practices or what have you, it's so easy when they're not working to think you're doing something wrong for yourself or for your client. Like, so maybe I could have improved in how I delivered it, maybe my pacing or my tone, or is the wrong stage, rather than thinking actually the blocks that are coming up, when they've kind of dysregulated or gone into their head, or say get really angry at you or dissociate or whatever it is, like they are exactly the most important things to come out of it. So every compassion intervention or exercise is an intervention that could help, but also the things that stop it from helping are the most important bits, because they will tell you where you need to go, really. So I think that's really helpful. Like if it's not working, good in a way, because that's flagging something ever so important for you or the other person about how they can't receive care and quietness or whatever it is you're trying to do. And we can always reflect on improvements to make when you're delivering something, but I think it's thinking about the block or the problem in those terms, or something that's happening between you, and it often tells you exactly where you need to go. Where did you first learn that you didn't deserve to be supported, or where did you first learn that voice that told you the opposite?
Reminds me of
Told me by my dad or my mum or whatever.
Yeah. Reminds me of conversations that I try to have with my husband when we are struggling through something, how I can really relate to him feeling safe enough to have a conversation with me when I make him feel that I still love him, that I'm just doubting or wanting to discuss something, but there is love foremost, and it's the most important thing. It's still there. I just wish to discuss something, or when I feel the need to show him that I did something where I came short, or where I want to apologize. I always try and do that in the most loving way for him and for me, because it's the most safest place to be able to go to places that hurt. If I try and first make a context of love before doing anything else.
And I think I think you're completely right. I think it's that ground level or core sense of acceptability and safeness within a relationship, or in relationship to oneself, that just some people don't have, and it just vanishes, doesn't it? So when things go wrong, there's not like a flaw to it. It kind of feels just like bottomless, like, oh, you say I'm doing something wrong, like everything about me feels wrong, or everything about you feels critical, and I can't hear what you're saying. And I think that's what compassion is about, is that, again, it comes out that love yourself as a person, doubt yourself as a therapist. Like it's, doubt yourself as a husband, I suppose, but, know that underneath it you're loved and you're okay, and etc. And then you can think about how you're maybe not great in a relationship or what have you.
Yeah, and I often look at it with the utmost respect when I talk to entrepreneurs, and I can see how they really want to learn how to have effective behavior, so to speak. And then when they have to talk to someone, even if it's their wives or their husbands, and talk about something they find difficult, how hard it is to have a true conversation about, I'm bothered by something and I wish to discuss it, let alone do this with their employees or with their managers that are high functioning, and how when that ground level of safety in themselves isn't there, then it's very hard to do so.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, I imagine in businesses and thinking about organisations in the UK, like the NHS, etc., or universities, it's, that ground level, I guess, is quite core to a person, but it can also be quite core to a culture and an organisation. And like, does the organisation foster and facilitate safeness, or and acceptance of mistakes and etc., or is it one of criticism and high drive? Is there space and time and underpinning principles and philosophies of care? And I think that makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it also makes me think of when I look at, for example, ACT, but also CFT. If I've I've trained a lot of psychologists and therapists in this, and then sometimes I can see them like using quote unquote the thing they've learned to help them find words to become more compassionate, but at the same time they're not. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like trying to have this acceptant kind of language, and I'm so sorry that I need to talk to you about, but then they're still talking in a way that is hurtful or painful, and so part of me says, yes, absolutely, we need more safety in all environments for sure. And at the same time, the way that sometimes it's learned or that people apply it makes it even, it's horrible to have a boss who tries to talk to you in a compassionate, safe way, but he's not really engaging in that process. So it's
or it's because it's mechanically applied like a technique. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's sometimes quite helpful, the distinction, I suppose, in terms of Paul Gilbert, the founder of Compassion Focused Therapy, talks about compassion being as a motivation. So we kind of set it as an intention, but then I suppose you need some skills to be able to enact it too. And actually, you can have all the best intention in the world, but you do need to practice it, and you do need to get feedback, and it does need to become fluid. But the skills need to be grounded in the kind of core motivation of care. It can't be like, I'm going to do some compassion skills under the motive of improving a profit margin. It doesn't really work.
Yeah, or more control. Like I'm going to share with you how I feel, and then this means that you need to take me into account because I just shared how I feel. That's a very controlling way of using these wonderful models.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. I suppose it talks to the idea of, Paul always talks about the skills that are associated with compassion. They can't be delivered without that intention, really. So, I mean, you could practice mindfulness, which is great, without the intention of being compassionate at the center, the motivation. Then you could practice mindfulness as a sniper and improve your mindful awareness of the people you're about to kill. Or you could practice empathy with another, but you could use that empathy with a different motivation, one of sort of cruelty or competition, to undermine them or to hurt them. So I suppose it's this idea of like motivation and then skills that serve that motivation, and then often the emotions too, but they can come often a little bit later too.
Yeah, true. I'm still curious about things that you've learned, lessons that you've learned from, I mean, having a history in anorexia and in depression so young, and having been taken care of so long, and taking care of yourself for so long, means you've learned a lot. It's in a sense, it's a very rich past as well.
Yeah. I wish I had some kind of words of wisdom from it, really.
Is there a moment where
I think some of the shifts come from,
No, you go.
I think for me anyway, it was, I suppose it is around those kind of bit. I think there was a real shift from like opening up to others and receiving care. I think that was a really important, difficult step back then. And interestingly, it came from a social worker, wasn't a therapist.
Those are the best.
It was just sort of basic contact. The best. And I think it's just that kind of human care and that space and time and trust and interest. And I think kind of later on, what really helped was, I think, coming more comfortable with some of the things that about me that feel quite like fixed, I suppose, like my temperament or my kind of general interest in life, really, like owning them a little bit more and working with them rather than trying to get rid of them. And I think it's once you do start befriending certain things that are, I don't know, slightly unwanted at times in you, then they kind of offer some, helpful ways of being in the world, really, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that shift from eradication to like acceptance, and then beyond acceptance, like a kind of like a valuing or finding value in some things like shyness of temperament. I think that's been really powerful and helpful.
And it's, I think more than ever, I realize by having this conversation with you that if this is your past or mine, I mean, I guess it's both is very intense as a past, but it means that life very consciously has crossed you many times.
Yeah.
And I guess most teens just go on, and I mean most young adults just go on and try and make the best of their lives, and then end up living a life that is just their lives and never question it. But if you have to question your life,
I think that's true, and I think almost having like a kind of breakdown or whatever you want to call it, that early on in life means you either kind of have to make a conscious choice to kind of carry on living, or to kind of go for it, and to reevaluate things and to make a change at that point. And I'm kind of glad that there was that kind of complete collapse and breakage of where I was going, really, and it did allow something else to come up that then has been like nurtured, I think, over time. I feel really lucky in a way that it occurred at a young age. You know, it was, I wish it didn't have to be so awful and painful and difficult and such a fracture, but I think it did provide that change in direction, really. That I think, other people hit maybe later on. And I think maybe something about being like suicidal, for if you have done, then that option is there in your head. And I think you have to make quite conscious choices about wanting to live and grasping things that are essential, and finding things that are important. And I think that's really powerful. Almost like when you hear people talk about they've had a heart attack and they suddenly are living for the first time. I get the sense you get more of those moments if you've been through something quite significant. That I think it's pretty hard to get to otherwise.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's true.
So maybe it's kind of like turning towards listening to, valuing, because I think in a weird way I'll change some things, but maybe not others.
Yeah, it's as you say. I when I look back, it feels like I'm very grateful. I wouldn't really want to change a thing apart from the fact that it hurt like hell.
Yeah.
I would like to change that, but other than that, it has taught me time and again a lot that I wouldn't have learned any other way, for sure.
I don't think it's all. I think, like, when it was very recent, it's just so much. It's just survival, I think, and you don't get your head above water. But I think if you can carry some of the gold from it all, then it does become quite special, I think. But I think at the time, and afterwards, I think the struggling to survive, that does block that reflection and that valuing. I think and you just live reactively. That's how I find it anyway.
It's a very powerful struggle, and if you win it, then you can have this. Then you're on the other side, and yes, you're more vulnerable, but you're more real and more in contact with life, I think.
Yeah. I think so.
True.
Yeah. It's strange. I think it's whole new dilemmas when you start thinking about your own children, what you've been through, because I'd like them to have some, some of the the insights and learning, but I wouldn't want them ever to go through the process. So I suppose that's quite interesting when I had it for him. Yeah.
You don't want your kids to hurt, and at the same time, it's probably the most important way to learn things.
Yeah.
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 True. Okay. Thank you very, very much for this open and wonderful conversation.
Nice to speak to you.